Wait, you're telling me the Philadelphia Flyers turned down a massive offer from the Toronto Maple Leafs for Rasmus Ristolainen, a 30-year-old defenseman who has now suffered season-ending injuries in back-to-back years. And we're supposed to believe Danny Briere made the right call here, because honestly, that decision is looking worse with every passing day. All right, folks, we need to talk about one of the most puzzling decisions of the entire 2025 trade deadline. According to a new report from Bruce Garriock of the Ottawa Sun, the Philadelphia Flyers received what a league source described as a moon from the Toronto Maple Leafs for veteran defenseman Rasmus Ristolainen, and Danny Briere said no. He actually turned it down. And now, just weeks after the March 7 trade deadline, we're watching this decision age like milk left out in the summer sun, because Ristolainen played exactly 3 more games before suffering another season-ending triceps injury on March 11th against the Ottawa Senators. That's the second consecutive year he's had his season cut short by injury. So let's break down what actually happened here, what Toronto might have offered, and whether Philadelphia made a catastrophic mistake. First, let's establish the timeline and the facts. The Maple Leafs were desperately looking for defensive help at the trade deadline. They ended up acquiring Brandon Carlo from the Boston Bruins in a blockbuster deal that sent top center prospect Fraser Minten, a 2026 first-round pick, and a 2025 fourth-round pick, which Toronto had originally acquired from Philadelphia in the Scott Laughton trade, to Boston. Carlo's cap hit after 15% retention came in at $3.25 million, significantly less than Ristolainen's $5.1 million cap hit. But here's the key detail. Before landing Carlo, Toronto apparently made a massive push for Ristolainen. A league source told Garriock the Leafs offered the moon and they still couldn't get him out of there. The moon, that's not typical trade deadline language for a 30-year-old defenseman with an injury history and a hefty contract. That suggests Toronto was willing to pay a premium price, possibly even more than what they eventually gave up for Carlo. Now, what exactly does a moon mean in this context? We don't have specifics, but we can make some educated guesses based on what Toronto paid for Carlo and what assets they had available. The Minten package that went to Boston is instructive. Fraser Minten was Toronto's first-round pick in 2022, a legitimate center prospect with NHL potential. If Toronto was willing to part with Minten for Carlo, it's entirely plausible they offered him, or someone comparable, to Philadelphia for Ristolainen. Let's think about Toronto's prospect pool at the time. They had Easton Cowan, a first-round pick who was tearing it up with the London Knights in the OHL, playing alongside Philadelphia prospects Denver Barkey and Oliver Bonk. They had Ben Danford, their 2024 first-round pick, a 6'2" right-shot defenseman who could theoretically replace Ristolainen in Philadelphia's long-term plans. And of course, they had multiple draft picks available, including first-rounders in future years. The report specifically mentions that the Flyers had already acquired a 2027 first-round pick and forward prospect Nikita Grabenkin from the Leafs in a previous deal. So there was already an established trading relationship between these organizations. That makes it even more plausible that Toronto's offer for Ristolainen included premium assets like Minten or other high-end prospects. Here's where this gets really interesting. Philadelphia couldn't retain salary on Ristolainen even if they wanted to. The Flyers had already used their 3 retention slots on the trades of Scott Laughton, Andrei Kuzmenko, and Kevin Hayes. That means any trade of Ristolainen to Toronto would have required the Leafs to take on his full $5.1 million cap hit, which is substantial for a team that's always navigating tight cap space. Despite that cap challenge, Toronto was still willing to offer the moon for Ristolainen. That tells you how desperate they were for defensive help and how highly they value what Ristolainen could bring to their lineup. At his best, Ristolainen is a big, physical, right-shot defenseman who can eat minutes, play in all situations, and bring playoff experience. Those are exactly the attributes Toronto has historically lacked on their blue line. So Danny Briere had a decision to make. He could accept Toronto's massive offer, potentially getting a first-round pick, a top prospect like Minten or Cowan, and maybe additional assets. For a 30-year-old defenseman with injury concerns and 2 years remaining on his contract at $5.1 million per season. Or he could hold on to Ristolainen, betting that he'd be more valuable to Philadelphia either as a player or as a trade chip in the future. Briere chose to keep him. And within days, that decision started looking questionable. Ristolainen played 3 more games after the trade deadline. 3 games, before suffering a triceps injury against Ottawa that ended his season. This came after he'd already had his 2023 to 2024 season cut short by injury. That's 2 consecutive years of season-ending injuries for a player who's turning 31 years old in October. Now, let's be fair to Danny Briere for a moment. At the time of the trade deadline, Philadelphia was still in the playoff hunt. They were fighting for a wild card spot, and Ristolainen was a key part of their defensive structure. Trading him away might have signaled to the locker room that management was giving up on the season. That's a legitimate concern when you're trying to build a winning culture and show your young players that the organization is committed to competing. Additionally, the Flyers have made it clear they want to build to the draft and develop young talent. Maybe Briere valued the opportunity to keep Ristolainen as a veteran presence for their young defensemen like Bonk and others coming to the system. Maybe he thought Ristolainen's leadership and experience were worth more than whatever prospects or picks Toronto was offering. But here's my counter-argument. If Toronto was truly offering the moon, if they were dangling Fraser Minten or Easton Cowan or Ben Danford plus picks, how do you justify turning that down for a 30-year-old with injury concerns? The Flyers are not one player away from being cup contenders. They're in a rebuild, or a competitive rebuild, as they like to call it. That's exactly the time when you should be converting veteran assets into young talent and draft capital. Think about what the Flyers could have done with a package centered around someone like Minten. He's a young center, exactly what Philadelphia desperately needs. They don't have a clear number 1 center in their system right now. Morgan Frost has been inconsistent. They're high on Matvei Michkov, obviously, but he's a winger. The center position is Philadelphia's biggest organizational weakness, and Toronto apparently was willing to give up a legitimate center prospect to acquire Ristolainen. Or imagine if the offer included Ben Danford, a right-shot defenseman who's 6'2", just like Ristolainen, but who's 20 years old instead of 30 and on an entry-level contract instead of making $5.1 million per season. That's literally a younger, cheaper replacement with potentially more upside. How do you turn that down? The report mentions that Philadelphia fans hoping for Flyers to make a big push for Mitch Marner this summer might see those odds improve based on betting markets. That's an interesting sidebar, but also illustrates the point. Philadelphia needs star power and elite talent to compete with the top teams in the Metropolitan Division. Trading Ristolainen for a massive haul at the deadline would have given them more ammunition to pursue someone like Marner or another big fish in free agency. Instead, they kept Ristolainen. He played 3 more games, got injured, and now Philadelphia enters the offseason with the same asset they had at the deadline. Except he's older, coming off another injury, and has 1 fewer year on his contract. His trade value has almost certainly declined. If Toronto was willing to give up the moon in March, what would they offer in June? What will anyone offer? Here's the really frustrating part for Flyers fans. This is a pattern we've seen before. Teams get emotionally attached to players. They overvalue what those players mean to their lineup, and they miss opportunities to maximize return on assets. Ristolainen is a useful player, don't get me wrong, but he's not irreplaceable. He's not a franchise cornerstone. He's a second-pairing defenseman making $5 million per year who's now suffered major injuries in consecutive seasons. The comparison to what Toronto eventually paid for Brandon Carlo is telling. Carlo is 28 years old compared to Ristolainen's 30. He makes less money against the cap after retention, and he's generally regarded as a better all-around defenseman. Toronto gave up Minten, a first-round pick, and a fourth-round pick for Carlo. If they were willing to offer more than that for Ristolainen, which the moon suggests, Philadelphia absolutely should have taken that deal. Let's talk about the injury situation specifically, because this is where things get really concerning for Philadelphia. Ristolainen's triceps injury on March 11th came during a game against Ottawa. Triceps injuries for hockey players can be serious, especially for a guy who relies on his physical style of play.